The recording. Thank you. Um, First of all, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening from where you are today. My name is Violet Esipila. I am the VP of Business and Economic Development for Black Professionals in International Affairs. I'm honored to be here today with you all and our invited guest speakers who will be speaking at the 8th Annual Forum Business and Economic Outlook for Africa. I will be introducing my colleague Clifford Young, the co-chair of Business and Economic Development to BPIA, and who will be moderating today's event. Clifford Young is a first generation American born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, to Jamaican and Vincentian immigrants. Okay. While growing up, Clifford attended New York City public schools before attending American University for his bachelor's degree in international studies. He graduated in 2021 and has gained experience in the executive and legislative branches of the federal government, the consulting sphere, the nonprofit sector, higher education, and the legal industry during and after his time as an undergraduate student. Clifford currently works in the investment banking industry as a compliance analyst, preventing instances and appearances of insider trading. These experiences have influenced his aspiration to become a global finance attorney for the International Monetary Fund. Clifford is also a member of Kiwanis International and the National Black MBA Association and high school student mentor with Mentor New York City. Clifford, thank you for taking your time today for moderating, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Violet, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everybody, and good day to all joining us. As Violet said, my name is Clifford Young. I will start by introducing all the guest speakers, and after each guest will have 15 minutes to share their expertise on today's topic, and questions will follow thereafter. We have 1 hour and 30 minutes, so we can ask the audience to start putting questions on the chat. And if we can't get to all of the questions, they will be answered via email after the meeting by our guest speakers. With that, thank you to our speakers for joining us. I will introduce them. The first of our speakers is Michele Fornino, who is an economist with the International Monetary Fund. He is an economist, more specifically in the Regional Studies Division of the African Department. He joined the International Monetary Fund in September of 2021 through the Economist program after completing a PhD in economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. During his time at the IMF, he has worked in the Financial Institutions Division of the Statistics Department, where he focused on the impact of climate change on the financial sector and took part in Article 4 missions to Kiribati and Luxembourg. He went on to join the African Department in March 2023. Since then, he collaborated on the drafting of 3 regional economic outlook reports and 2 analytical notes on the economic relationship between sub-Saharan Africa and China, and on policies to expand access to education in the region. He joined the Mali country team in November of 2023. His research interests include fiscal policy, issues at the intersection of macroeconomics and labor economics, automation, and the future of work. Thank you, Michele, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Next, we have Nii Simmons, who is the founder and executive director of the Diaspora Country Index. Nii Simmons is a seasoned leader in emerging and frontier markets with professional experience spanning various global markets. He holds senior fellow positions at institutions such as TED Conferences, the Royal Society of Arts UK, Center for Global Development, and the Meridian International Center. These roles are in recognition of his efforts in digital development, advancing manufacturing, private sector, and economic development, and scaling innovative solutions and disruptive technologies in Africa and other emerging markets. Nii has served in previous capacities as a venture advisor, board observer, and EIR. Nii is well versed in analyzing science, engineering, innovation, and digital transformation in various markets for early stage innovation. Through this experience, he offers valuable guidance on robotics and automation, biotechnology, agtech, AI and ML, additive manufacturing, and responsible technology practices. Nii also provides advice on efficient solutions for overcoming challenges in frontier markets and fostering relations between the US and EU and Africa. Furthermore, he has extensive expertise in integrating African emerging technologies, R&D, and critical minerals into Western supply chains. Nii has previous management and P&L responsibilities with billion-dollar brands at Fortune 500 companies such as Big Pharma and Biotech, consumer products, FMCG and CPG, and strategy consulting. These roles have focused on strategic and long-term financial planning for various business units and advising C-level executives on growth strategy, product development, joint venture, and competitive strategy for brand and product categories. Additionally, Nii has worked and consulted globally for the World Bank Group, the African Development Bank, the US State Department, and the European Commission in the private sector and entrepreneurship development sectors. Nii was the creator of the African Diaspora Private Sector Engagement Program at the World Bank, which was part of the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice. The program's main objective was to engage African diaspora professionals to assist SMEs and early stage businesses in Africa by integrating into global supply chains. In addition, Nii has been a thought leader in creating supply chain supplier programs to integrate OEM suppliers in frontier and emerging markets who have disruptive, innovative solutions or products that can scale to global supply chains. Furthermore, Nii focuses on early stage venture building and integrating SMEs and suppliers to global supply chains for shared value. Thanks, Nii, for being with us today, and we really appreciate your time. Our third speaker, Nneka Chiming, is a partner and co-head of Africa Advisory at Crossboundary. Nneka Chiming is an investment professional with a strong generalist toolkit in strategy, project finance, investments, operations, and general management. She has a strong interest in leveraging technology, innovation, and investments to create a more equitable and sustainable world. Cross-cultural sensitivity and ability to be more impactful across frontier, emerging, and developed markets, and also has experience in varied sector experience and interests. She is also skilled at leading high-performance teams. She holds a Master's of Engineering, particularly in chemical engineering, in addition to a Master's in Business Administration, all from Harvard University. Thank you, Nneka, for joining us. I appreciate your time on behalf of BPIA. So we will first dive into the topic with Michele. Your time begins.
Thank you very much, Clifford, for the kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I thought to discuss a little bit today the latest regional economic outlook that we produced in the African department so that we can go over what are the latest developments for the region. And then that I would, towards the end of the presentation, give a little bit of an overview of how the IMF is engaging with countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So let me spend just a word on the regional economic outlook. This is a report, one of 5 regional reports that the IMF produces every 6 months. And these reports focus on the economic developments in each of the 5 area departments at the IMF. Specifically, of course, ours focuses on Sub-Saharan Africa, so it has a focus really tailored on how the economies of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are doing. This contrasts with other flagship reports that the IMF produces, such as the World Economic Outlook, that have a global approach to economic policy making. As part of this report, we usually have one longer chapter that is more conjunctural and talks about the latest developments, and then analytical notes on more structural, longer-term topics of issue. And this time around, they were centered on job creation, growth divergence, and gender equality in the region. I will be presenting today the analytical chapter, but if there is any interest, I can expand also on those notes as well. So let me dive right in. In the first part, we will focus on recent developments on the outlook for 2024 and 2025 to capture what are the key elements that policymakers have to contend with. So the first positive message is that internal and external macroeconomic imbalances have started to narrow, and this mainly reflects policy adjustments that governments throughout the region have been carrying out in the last couple of years. So we can start by looking at the situation of debt, public debt specifically in historical context between 2020 and 2025. As we can see, after rising rapidly over the last decade, and of course during the pandemic years, it has broadly stabilized. Of course, this is just the median of the debt to GDP ratio across countries. So there's a few countries in which that, unfortunately, is still pretty high, even above 80%. So more work would need to be done there. As I said, this stabilization that we see in recent years is mostly due to the fiscal consolidation that countries have achieved in the last couple of years. As we can see from 2022 onwards, they've really tightened their budgets considerably, and this tightening is projected to continue into 2025 as well. On the inflation front, policymakers have really had to tighten monetary policy under difficult circumstances. First, because of the pandemic-induced supply shortages and the inflation that occurred in much of the world, and then because after the war in Ukraine started in 2022, commodity prices further increased, putting on strains on prices throughout the region. As a result of these policy choices, inflation is coming down, and this is a trend that we are observing even in advanced economies and other emerging markets, and it continues also in sub-Saharan Africa. However, there's quite a bit of dispersion across countries. So while the median country has managed to fight off inflation to a large extent, in about half of the countries, we still see inflation above target, and in a third of the countries, inflation is still in double digits. So quite a bit of work remains to be done there, especially as we can see here in countries in which the currency is not pegged to either the euro or the US dollar. On the funding side, after 2 years of funding squeeze, there are some good news recently. And the first one is that $6 billion have been raised on international financial markets by countries in the region. So they've managed to tap international bond markets. And this happened after almost 18 months unable to do so. And the second good news is that Ghana's debt restructuring finally was agreed upon early in October, and this has already resulted in lower spreads, as we can see here on the chart on the left. Now, this is not to say that despite this good news, the funding squeeze that has been ongoing in the region is over by any means. Unfortunately, it is still very hard for countries to finance the much needed expenditures that they have. And on top of that, there are very large interest and principal repayments on that are coming due in the next few years. And so, of course, the needs are pretty high, and liquidity situation is still tight. So let me now turn to the region's growth outlook. For 2024, we project growth at 3.6%, and this is a weighted average, of course, in the region. This was revised a little bit downwards compared to earlier in the year, and this is mainly to do with the fact that we observed conflict and insecurity becoming worse in certain parts of the continent, especially in the Sahel region. There's been a very impactful drought in Southern Africa, especially earlier in the year, and this has caused shortages of hydroelectric power generation, as well as issues in agriculture, mainly Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And there's also been a spate of electricity shortages affecting many countries, such as the Central African Republic, Guinea, Madagascar, and Mali, that I'm the one most familiar with. And of course, the ongoing macroeconomic tightening that has been carried out by policymakers, as we discussed, has also impacted the growth outlook. For 2025, we see a relatively broad-based uptake in growth. So we project it at 4.2%, and inflation is expected to continue to decline broadly within the region. However, there's two issues to keep in mind when we discuss growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. The first one is that there's significant variation between countries. So especially we observe between countries that are exporters of raw materials and oil, especially, and countries that have more diversified economy. The former ones tend to grow much more slowly, approximately 3% per annum, compared to the other ones, more diversified economy that managed to achieve much better growth rates. And this divergence is persistent and is continuing and is projected to continue going forward and is one of the key features of growth in the region. The other one is that unfortunately, we still see growth to be too low, especially when it is in per capita terms. So this means that living standards are not improving fast enough for the continent to converge in the long run towards the living standards observed in emerging markets and advanced economies. And this is one of the key challenges that policymakers have to contend with in Sub-Saharan Africa. Let me quickly go over what are the main risks that we see for the outlook. The first one is climate shocks and their intensification. As we discussed, droughts have had a measurable impact on growth already this year, but we have observed monsonic floods in Eastern Africa, as well as floods in Western Africa in the last couple of months that have been truly devastating, especially in West Africa, with millions being displaced. So we see this as a really manifestation of a global trend of intensification of climate shocks, and it is a key risk that we have to monitor going forward. And it also motivates the engagement that we have with the region, which I will discuss later. The other key risk that is regional in nature that we are tracking is the spread of the Mpox disease. About 1/3 of countries have reported at least one case so far. And so this is a developing situation, and we are closely monitoring, potentially could be impactful going into next year. And then turning to more global factors, of course, volatility in commodity price is always an underlying risk for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and this could be really brought about, for instance, in intensification of the war in the Middle East. Slowdown in advanced economies and large emerging markets is also a key risk. For instance, we have seen China's economy not performing very well in recent months, and there are concerns about monetary policy tightening to really bring back inflation towards target in advanced economies, also potentially having an impact. Finally, there's been a pickup in volatility in financial markets in recent months, and this is always potentially concerning for the region as insofar as it affects the funding costs that countries are facing. Now, let's discuss what is the third key element that policymakers have to contend with in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it is relatively novel compared to the last few years. So we already mentioned two. One is very tight financing situation, so the ongoing funding squeeze, and the other one is relatively sluggish and subdued growth. The third challenge is a complex social and political situation in many countries. For instance, in Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, just to mention a few, we have seen important episodes of social unrest this year. Protesters often lament their hardships, and in particular, high food prices are a prime concern. As we can see in the chart on the right, for example, food prices have risen much more than the overall price level in the last few years. And this is just a median. There's countries in which this effect has been much more pronounced. On top of episodes of social unrest related to these issues, Africa remains also disproportionately affected by political fragility, which manifests, for instance, as conflicts or coups. These have primarily affected the Sahel region in recent years. Our report finds that social unrest is a complex phenomenon that cannot easily be explained by a single underlying cause. Structural weaknesses, including poverty, exclusion, lack of opportunity, perceptions of corruption, or realities of corruption, can be exacerbated by macroeconomic shocks, which then act as triggers. We also find that these events can have persistent macroeconomic effects, especially in countries with limited policy space and weak institutions. So, summarizing the socioeconomic environment, the environment that policymakers are facing, there are three key issues, as we said. One is low growth, the other one is a tight financing condition, and the third one is social unrest. At the same time, it's clear to us judging by the outlook, as we have summarized at the beginning, that inaction is not an option for policymakers. Many countries in the region still have to consolidate their fiscal budgets. Inflation is not under control in many countries across the region, so really they need to keep at it and continue in their path on stabilization. But of course, this comes with very difficult trade-offs, and we are very cognizant of those trade-offs. The first one is that, as we said, macroeconomic stability is a very important goal, but of course, this comes on the back of elevated development needs that the region has, and this includes infrastructure investment, health, education, so more social capital investment. And all of these things require additional financing, often in the tens of billions of dollars a year, just to give a metric. And finally, of course, there's social frustration due to the many shocks that countries have faced and to the adjustment. And so this complicates further the job of policymakers because it restricts what they can realistically achieve. So our main point then is that taking stock of all the macroeconomic variables taken together, we are able to summarize what is the state of each country in the region in terms of their overall imbalances. And this includes fiscal policy, monetary policy, as well as the external position in terms of exchange rates, for instance. Now, we identified that about half of the countries in the region still face high levels of imbalances. What this means is that either their fiscal deficits or their debt is too high, so they're having to pay too much interest rate on their outstanding debt, or they don't have enough foreign exchange reserves to guarantee stability of the exchange rate, or for instance, inflation is too high. About half of the countries fall into this bucket. For these countries, we advise them to continue with urgent and front-loaded adjustment as much as possible, but at the same time carrying out the adjustment by protecting the most vulnerable. So concretely, what this means is that if we need to consolidate the budgets, we should do so by trying to raise new revenues for the public sector, so potentially increasing taxes that in the region are quite low, but at the same time, this should not affect the livelihoods of the poorest in these countries, which should be compensated, for instance, with transfers. In countries that are a little bit more lucky, in which imbalances are assessed to be medium or moderate, our advice is that they can proceed with a more gradual pace in their adjustment, especially perhaps most of these countries already have achieved lower inflation, so they can turn monetary policy on a more neutral stance. And finally, there's a few lucky countries in which imbalances are overall pretty low, so they don't need to adjust necessarily in the short term, but our advice here is to be conservative and prudent and to prefer investment in infrastructure, human capital, and to rebuild buffers whenever possible so that future shocks will not be as detrimental. Okay, let me now turn to the final part of the presentation. I want to expand a little bit on the role of the IMF on the region. So the IMF broadly has three main functions when we engage with our member countries. The first one is surveillance, and surveillance is exactly the kind of work that I did today, presenting an instance of multilateral surveillance. We take stock of how the economies are faring, what are the challenges of policymakers, and we engage with them and provide advice whenever they need it. The other two key ways in which we engage with our membership are, of course, through lending, and this happens especially when countries have issues on their balance of payment position on the external sector, so they're finding a shortage of funding and they need to come to us for assistance on that, as well as capacity development, which is an umbrella term that essentially means assisting countries in implementing practices in domains ranging from tax administration to statistics, financial sector issues, to really help public authorities get to best practices in every domain in terms of especially data collection and policy making in practice. So let me delve a little bit deeper on the issue of lending and then capacity development. It's important to keep in mind what is the backdrop in which the IMF is operating these days in the region. In particular, official development assistance has been on the decline for decades. These are transfers from countries to mostly advanced economies to countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this secular decline that we can observe here in this chart is pretty stark. It goes from about 4.5 to 6% of GDP in the 90s, and then it declined to 3% in the 2000s, and then now it's lower between 2 and 3% of GDP. Now, part of this trend is good news because it means that countries are growing, so this ratio is naturally falling. They will be less dependent on foreign aid, and this is, of course, good. But at the same time, we ought to keep in mind the development needs that we discussed before, which are very much still there, and they really beget financing. So the first challenge that we're facing is an overall compressed official development assistance envelope. Now, at the fund, during the last decade, we have stepped up our efforts. Just a few statistics to highlight. Since 2020, we have disbursed $60 billion to countries in the region, and 5 billion, a little bit over 5 billion, both in 2023 and 2024, just to give a metric. 26 countries have ongoing financing arrangement with the IMF out of the 45 that we oversee in the African department of the IMF. And on top of this, 11 have an resilience and sustainability facility in place, which is a particular IMF program tailored for challenges related to climate change issues. So how to help countries that have climate investments in mind, and they would like to finance those investments. So this is very concessional lending with very easy terms for these countries to really finance those investments. 11 countries have that. And the facility was only launched in October 2022. To conclude, just a quick word on capacity development. As I noted earlier, the IMF is stepping up its effort in terms of lending, but it's also doing so in terms of capacity development because we recognize that production of good data, production of good statistics, as well as implementation of best practice is a key avenue for countries in the region to really improve their management and their policy making. And here the key message is that we anticipate an increase of about 1/4 in capacity development directed towards the region. And the other key message is that climate change issues are becoming more and more an important part of the capacity development that we provide to country authorities. So let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to elaborate on any of these points in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Michele. Next, we will move on to Nii. Nii, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Clifford. Good afternoon. My name is Nii Simmons. I'm the founder, executive director of the DCI Diaspora Country Index, and was recently a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and Center for Global Development. I'll make my remarks short so that we can go into Q&A. I do I wear a lot of hats. One of the hats I do work in, or one of the sectors I work in, or areas of focus I work in, is diaspora engagement. When I was at the World Bank Group, I did create the World Bank's framework around diaspora engagement under the Trade and Competitive Global Practice, which is now, I believe the new name is FDI. I may have had that wrong. Anyways, today I'll talk a little bit about how the diasporas can be a conduit to support economic development. I mean, this is a panel around Africa's economic outlook. The past few years, I would say 3-4 years since COVID, COVID has sort of exacerbated a lot of countries' economic outlook. It just showcased the situation. There's not one country in this world that was not impacted by COVID, right? So what does that mean for trade, competitiveness, and also national security concerns in Africa? A previous Michelle gave a great overview about what the IMF does, what it doesn't do, and you know how these countries have the debt burden is painful. Recently, we saw earlier this year how country like Kenya was dealing with this debt issue, and they decided to raise taxes on everyday commodities. And because of that, you saw protests in around Nairobi, right? So Kenya is not the only country that's dealing with this. You have Nigeria, you have Ghana, a slew of other countries, not just in Africa, but around the world. So what does that mean in terms of engaging one's diaspora, right? The diaspora should not be used sort of as a often I hear, how can our diaspora, how can the African diaspora be used to support a country's budget, which I think that's not the right way to go about it. I think if you are engaging in diaspora and it's an ongoing relationship, it's symbiotic, it's natural, it's organic, and your diaspora should be used when, you know, there's things that are going on that make sense, and it impacts everybody, right? But countries also need to get their house order. If you're trying to attract foreign direct investment, but you're not even engaging your own diaspora, why would a foreign direct investor want to invest in their country, right? Good case in point would be most countries have a foreign embassy or consulate overseas. You know, most people renew their passport, they renew their visa, go for some kind of consular services, right? So if these diaspora, if your country's extension is at one of your properties, what are you doing to engage your diaspora? Are you doing a TEDx talk? Are you doing a brown bag lunch? Are you talking about AI? These are things that one needs to do to engage your diaspora. Especially as the demographics of the continent scale from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion. The demographic boom is going to be painful, but I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities and challenges. You know, there are challenges and opportunities with that. We have to grow more food. We have to house people, livelihoods and jobs, right? So how can the diaspora be a conduit to that to that effect, right? Science and innovation. I'm big on utilizing science and innovation. There's not one country in this world that hasn't developed using science and innovation. If you look at all the most of OECD countries, the ones that have that are advanced are using science and innovation to develop, and I think we need to do that. And how can the diaspora be a conduit for that? Electricity. Electricity is we need baseload electricity. That's you know, it goes without saying. I mean, you know, a lot of people talk about AI and digital transformation. I'll talk about that in a second, but you can talk about AI and digital transformation till the cows come home. But if you don't have baseload electricity, if you don't have power, you can't run a large language model, and then you need to store the information. You need to have data centers, right? And if you store it overseas, you still need connectivity, right? So these are challenges that are going to persist. Now, getting back to our economic outlook, we know now that digital transformation, digital trade is a big part of countries' GDP. How can one country take advantage by utilizing their diaspora? Maybe there's a group of diaspora that worked at Accenture, IBM, or Google. How is a country utilizing their diaspora as a force multiplier to support digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, DPI is what we call it, or digitalization, or technical assistance or mentorship? So these are themes and things that are going to be coming up, and we need to think about, especially when, you know, the amount of power or the amount of electricity that is going to be needed to support digitalization across the world is going to grow by a factor of 3, right? In this country, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and they're now talking about we need to increase the power of electricity generation by a factor of 3, right? And the only way you can do that currently is through nuclear. You can't do it through, I guess you could do it through gas, but then you have to worry about greenhouse gases. So are we ready for that in Africa to go nuclear? I'm not sure. You know, we have to worry about maintenance. We have to worry about storing the nuclear fuel. These are all challenges that countries will have to think about. And then last but not least, as countries need to service their debt, how can we look at other countries who have deployed their diaspora in a way that makes sense? I don't know why we don't look at what has been done in Ethiopia. The Ethiopians have done a great job to create this Grand Renaissance Dam. That dam was built without the World Bank or any other multilateral, the Chinese implementing, and that was the Ethiopian Habesha community coming together over 30 years, even when 2 decades of the previous government being there. They pulled the resources. It was, I guess, it was some form of a structured finance vehicle, like a diaspora run, and there was coupon payments. Most people didn't expect a dividend, but because of that strong cultural tie that Ethiopia has, the Ethiopian diaspora has, that's how Ethiopia was able to utilize their diaspora. Now, I'm Ghanaian American. Could Ghana do this, something like this? I think that question is still to be answered, right? So I'll leave that there. I think those are some food for thought, and looking forward to engaging in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Mi. Next, we will head to Nneka.
Thank you, Clifford. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Nneka Chime. I'm a partner at Cross Boundary Advisory. And Cross Boundary is an advisory firm that we focus on unlocking private capital for sustainable growth in underserved markets. Our mission really is to drive investment into critical sectors for economic development, such as energy, healthcare, infrastructure, agriculture, amongst others. We work with donors, development partners, DFIs, private equity, venture capital, governments, institutional investors, private investors. So we work with basically the full spectrum of capital providers. And we are also experts in blended finance. I'll speak more about that as we go on, but we really believe that to have the sort of scale and speed we need to achieve the outcomes that we need to find ways to bring all parties together, because we need all the capital. Capital has different flavors, different expectations, different return thresholds, and no one pool can achieve the scale and speed of impact that we need. So we really work closely with local stakeholders and international partners to structure and mobilize financing in a way that is catalytic and promotes inclusive growth. Across Africa, we have 11 offices, so including, the more mature markets like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, but also 2 offices in DRC, also in Mauritius, Tunisia, and also have an on-the-ground presence in places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Benin, Mali. So we really believe that you need to be on the ground to find these opportunities. Our thesis is that capital availability is often a challenge, but one challenge that is often overlooked is that capital absorption is also a really big challenge. Because globally, across institutional capital markets, we're sitting on over 100 trillion in capital. What does capital want? Capital often wants returns. Returns come from bankable, well-structured deals. And to make those deals happen, you really need to be on the ground, working with all the different parties to put those deals together. So that's where we focus on, in being on the ground, being close to markets, and structuring transactions in ways that can really mobilize the pools of capital that we need. So across Africa, just to give you a sense of the scale of the need. So, I'll just zoom in on Nigeria alone. I'm Nigerian American, but based in Nigeria, here in Lagos. I oversee our Africa business, but yeah, based in Nigeria. So looking at Nigeria and infrastructure alone, so we're looking at an estimated 100 billion annual investment gap, right? So looking at what the government is dedicating to infrastructure capital expenditure is less than 10% of this. So clearly government alone cannot close the gap. Michele, in his earlier opening remarks, also talked about declining ODA. So, ODA by nature, it's not infinite, so declines naturally, and then it also like it's non-sticky, right? Depends on what the priorities of the donor nations are. So we're also in an environment of declining ODA. But then if you look at the global institutional markets, there's 100 trillion of assets in institutional capital markets. So we really believe that private markets have a big role to play, but we understand that there are barriers that keep that private capital from flowing. So PPPs and blended finance are ways where you can really like start to close that gap, but requires like very thoughtful sort of underground structuring. When it comes to PPPs, the biggest issue is that's a coordination issue, right? So to make one deal happen, you need alignment and coordination across different agencies. So let's look, for example, at healthcare, because I do a lot of work in healthcare and just completed a recent engagement there. So if you want to, make a healthcare manufacturing business like come to fruition in a place like Nigeria, so you need investment, you need the government because you need the agencies, you need folks like the WHO who have like pre-qualification requirements for commodity manufacturing factories, so they need to give you that certification, which is often also a barrier to entry because that costs money, costs time. It needs you to know the process and know how to engage. And then you also need to engage the private sector as well, right? In terms of like distribution, then the points of use as well. So to enable one, to build one pharmaceutical manufacturing plant, you need to coordinate all these different stakeholders. And so it becomes a first mover disadvantage. So we're used to talking of a first mover advantage, but in some markets across Africa, it really is a first mover disadvantage where you're trying to coordinate all these very different stakeholders, align all parties to make one deal happen. So when it comes to PPPs, I believe that PPPs hold a lot of promise, but requires very thoughtful coordination. One thing that I'm seeing in Nigeria that's promising is having some special intervention units. So in the healthcare space, for example, there's the Presidential Unlocking Healthcare Value Chain Initiative, where the president has mandated a coordinator to be able to pull all these different stakeholders together in a way that helps to bring some specific opportunities to fruition. So we need more of that because coordination is a big problem, and to really like mobilize those pools of capital like talked about, we need coordination first and foremost. Another issue I see is also in looking at like the local institutional capital market. So talking of things like local pension funds, for example. So even though Nigerian pension assets, they've grown, they're sitting on, significant pools of capital, maybe in the order of 10 to 20 billion USD, thereabouts. But primarily this capital is chasing government securities, right? So because of, for various reasons, which I won't go into all the details of. But these pools of capital are, they have the right currency denomination to fund local infrastructure projects, and also has the right tenor just due to the tenor of pension commitments. But this pool of capital is currently underutilized, right? So there's more that we can do, and this is where we can get help from the likes of the donor community to help like just mobilize the assets that are also there untapped, and then also requires like regulatory will as well. In Nigeria, for instance, like most states they cannot tap into markets because they cannot issue like subnational bonds at the state level due to unfunded pension commitments. Being able to tap into those markets will help them to actually, address the precarious situation they're in, where they can't fund their pension liability as it is, and they have a limited headroom to engage in productive investment that will enable them to meet those obligations. So I think there are low-hanging fruit that we can tackle to just make these pools of capital sort of more productive. And yeah, so I see a lot of promise in this area. Nii also spoke about diaspora, and diaspora is also an interesting bright spot. So looking at the size of the African diaspora, so we have over 170 million Africans worldwide. And so people always talk about remittances, so sending more than 50 billion in remittances annually, with a country like Nigeria, which has a very strong diaspora, attracting about 20 billion USD annually in remittances into the country. So in terms of remittances, probably not a pool of capital that can be redirected towards investment, just given the nature of remittances are often funding, essential goods and services for family members, things like healthcare, things like education. So not always easy to channel that capital towards investment, but still a pool of capital that must be acknowledged, just giving the size and the scale. But yeah, so another angle we can look at is just thinking of the diaspora as also a captive audience, right? So we have this pool of people with links to Africa that could be potential consumer bases for trade-oriented businesses, for tourism. And so these are things we don't often talk about, right? So what happens if, like 50% of these 170 million Africans and people of African origin worldwide, 50% are spending $1,000 a year on purchasing African goods and services, right? That is material. If we're increasing like tourism flows, so things like that also boost the economy. So we should also look to how we can tap into those, and that requires, most often government to create the environment, right? Because fundamentally the diaspora, they're diaspora for a reason, right? They left because they had no trust in the ability of their states primarily. People emigrate for different reasons, but people are diaspora, because they left because they faced like challenging situations back home. So it's important to engage with the diaspora, just recognizing that and having the humility to realize that there are reasons that drove their emigration. So that should shape any sort of investment policy that aims to tap into that pool of capital. So yeah, so these are some things that I will just touch on now. I don't want to take up all the airtime, so I will really stop here. But I think my closing thought before we go into Q&A is just thinking about how we can really like just coordinate and tap into those different pools of capital, because one group alone cannot solve, cannot take us with the scale and speed where we need to go, right? So we really need coordination, we need engagement, we need to be thoughtful about how we bring in those capital pools. And we need groups that are on the ground, really, because deals happen step by step, right? Like understanding opaque markets where there are information asymmetries really requires stakeholders that are willing to be on the ground, navigate these markets, understand the stakeholders, and can put deals together, because, happen deal by deal. But the good thing about pioneer transactions is that, when they're successes, they can really become kind of self-sustaining, right? So what we need more pioneer transactions. Those will need, kind of that push to get us there. But I really believe that we can build some momentum when we have like some, significant pioneer transactions. I also have some thoughts around sustainability as well, just giving some of the things like Michele talked about. So obviously, I think the last few years post-COVID have just shown us the importance of resilience as well. So, also being thoughtful about like de-dollarization efforts, trading more intra-Africa. I'm thinking of how to have like counter-cyclical investments, boost resilience to global shocks, because, they will come again. Like, is it going to be Mpox? It could be Mpox. It could be something else we don't even know about. But what we know for sure is that there will be shocks. So it's about being prepared. And yeah, I guess making hay while the sun shines and setting ourselves up for those moments that we know, difficult moments that will come. Yeah, so I'll stop there, and yeah, look forward to answering any specific questions. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Nneka. We will now head into Q&A, question and answer. The first question goes to Michele. Could you provide an overview of the total IMF loans allocated to African countries in 2023? Specifically, we're interested in a breakdown by country if possible, including any associated interest rates or any information on the projects that these loans have funded. And then lastly, if you could highlight any successful projects or initiatives.
Thank you, Clifford. So, I wouldn't be here listing numbers for each country. All of this information is publicly available on the IMF website. You can, if you're interested in any specific country, all of the information regarding the outstanding loans is readily available there. However, having said that, I will provide you with an overview of our engagements in the region. So first of all, let me say that the IMF and the World Bank are two sister institutions, were created almost 80 years ago. Really, there is a separation of duties between us and the bank. The bank really engages on eradicating poverty by providing support to specific projects. So it's a much bigger institution than the IMF. They employ very different kinds of talent, also in specific fields. engineers, lawyers, because of course they need to review specific projects and engage with the authorities and also with other stakeholders on carrying out those projects. At the fund, we mainly engage with governments and with policymakers, and our focus is really markedly on macroeconomic stability. So that's our bread and butter. That's why we exist as an institution. So having said that, so our end goal is macroeconomic stability. What we do is mainly providing budget support to governments, to public budgets of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically for our department. What that means in practice is that, of course, as new factors come into play, so nobody was talking about climate change 40, 50 years ago, for example, but nowadays it's obviously one of the most important challenges that we face globally. Of course, the institution evolves. So we take stock of the fact that climate change, for example, is important and something needs to be done about it. And insofar as it affects macroeconomic stability, and it is well established that it does, of course, our mandate also changes. That's why we introduced new facilities such as the Resilient Sustainability Facility, endowed with more than $40 billion to sustain countries as they carry out projects in those areas. So just to explain very briefly how we engage with countries. Usually, because of the shocks that we've been discussing, a country may find itself unable to pay for imports of essential goods such as oil or food. And when that happens, there needs to be someone who steps in and provides the necessary funding. And as the lender of last resort, in a way, that's the job of the IMF. And we do so by engaging with countries agreeing on a so-called IMF program, which what it is an agreement between us and the governments designed in a way that we provide funding to close these gaps on the balance of payment, and countries essentially engage in carrying out structural reforms, and we agree with them on what those structural reforms could be so that their footing is better in the future. And the end goal of it all is that countries will find themselves better positions to and more resilient to this kind of shock. So just talking about the last few years, as I said, we provided 60 billion in funding to countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. This includes an extraordinary so-called SDR allocation. Is a little bit of a technical term, but what it means is that we have created reserve assets and we have distributed to countries across the region according to their quotas, and these are assets that they could just sell to other member countries and get the proceeds and pay for whatever they needed. This was in 2021. And on top of that, we provided emergency financing, especially in 2020 at the height of the pandemic, and we continue to do so in 2022, 3 and 2024 as well. And in the last 2 years, we have provided a little over $5 billion in funding. Let me just conclude. This funding that we provide is on a recurrent basis. So we engage with countries every 6 months when there is a program, for example. We have reviews, so we provide the disbursement and then we keep track of the macroeconomic outcomes, and then the executive board allows us to continue dispersing if everything is on track.
Sounds good. On the same note of global shocks, this next question is for Nneka. With respect to adapting to global shocks, considering the International Monetary Fund or the IMF's warning about vulnerabilities to global external shocks, what innovative financial instruments can help, or what are available that can help African nations build resilience against such challenges?
Yeah, thank you so much for that great question. Yeah, so I think I think I ended my intro just really talking about shocks. So we don't know where the next shock will come, but we know like for sure it will come. So I think in terms of building resilience to shocks, so it's all about trying to think of like what are those key things where we're most vulnerable, right? And so it's in things like health security, food security, also climate as well. So those are sort of like 3 areas that typically get hit the hardest, and where it's typically very, very crushing when you deal with disruptions in those areas. So, I mean, I think the best way we could hedge against shocks. So there are a couple of things. The first is, just really being counter-cyclical in investing. So a lot of African nations have like sovereign wealth funds with a mandate to have some sort of counter-cyclical measure. So things like stabilization funds, with the same principle of, like saving when times are good, so that even when there are external disruptions, you can keep investing so things don't grind to a halt. So that's one thing that African countries can really do, just to make sure that they're best positioned to weather those shocks when they come. And then also things like just tapping into local markets. So when it comes to things like infrastructure, a lot of the capital needs are actually local currency, but the deficit is actually in local currency financing, right? So one of the issues that African countries have faced in this era of just rapid like currency devaluations across different African countries is just, you're dealing with a double-edged sword, right? You have inflation domestically, but then you also have to like service foreign denominated debt. So what we're seeing is that a lot of the projects actually need local currency financing, but that financing isn't really as available as it should be. One of the reasons is, the capital that should be chasing those projects, like pension funds, are instead like chasing government securities. So thinking of ways to really just like unlock that local currency financing and just make it available for infrastructure projects also helps to hedge. Because what happens is that if you face devaluations, which tend to happen when you have like external shocks, right, that can really like skew your balance of trade, then at least you're servicing debt that is in your domestic currency, right? So you don't have to deal with like exchange rate like fluctuations. So that's one measure. And yeah, a lot of the DFIs are really hesitant to enter into like local currency like financing situations because they too want to like hedge against like their risk. And in my view, I think DFIs really don't take as much risk as they should. Because someone has to take foreign exchange risk, right? And what is foreign exchange risk? Like that really arises when you have like structural imbalances. That means that the demand for local currencies are always going to reduce because every currency out there is, chasing the dollar and the euro. So we really need like forward-leaning institutions that are actually willing to just like take like that. To me, that's the role of a DFI, right? You're there to like create a market that is, somewhat broken or isn't there yet. So I really think that we need more players to take that local currency debt. And then there's also a role of the folks that are local. So local institutionals, but then also local high net worths, because we're seeing like, obviously there's a lot of panic and fear in the market. People want security. So even the funding that's available is also like, flying out of the continent and not being productive. We're seeing, for example, countries are holding their reserves in, banks abroad, like keeping their reserves in European and US banks. And then when we have the multilaterals trying to raise financing, they're going back to these foreign institutions, but these institutions are holding their reserves. So it's almost like a vicious cycle. So we really need to think about that like structural imbalance that exists. And yeah, so I think more local currency financing, both from the folks that are local, because, we have the most to lose if things get worse. So we should be taking the risk in our markets, but also from the DFIs, right? Like DFIs they should take on that risk where it makes sense. I'm not saying like dive headfirst into every risky situation, but realize that, they have a role to play. I was at an event at Climate Week where there was a DFI that was talking about like looking for junior capital, and I raised my eyebrows like that should be your role, right? Like you shouldn't be looking for like junior like that is your role. You're here to like stimulate the market. So we actually need more players like that. And we're seeing some that are diving headfirst. The likes of like USAID Prosper Africa actually have some programming that is really trying to be catalytic with the capital that they do have. So these are the kind of measures that will really help African countries just weather the next storm, because it's a question of when, not if, right?
Exactly. On a little bit of a different note, for me, as it pertains to remittances and economic growth, so I thought it was very convenient that that's where we left off with Nika. How do you view the impact of remittances from the diaspora on local economies, and particularly in the context of the IMF's findings?
Sure. Actually, I'd like to also add to what
Oh, please.
the other panelists added to. We haven't talked about some of the other the newer entrants to this multilateral financing space. The New Development Bank, commonly referred to as BRICS Bank, think the secretary is in Brazil, and then AIIB, which is the infrastructure, which you know, it's more infrastructure, but that still needs to be discussed. These two entities have changed the game from the standpoint that the Eurocentric Western institutions, these Bretton Woods institutions, have been the lender of last resort. Now you have another option for not just African countries, but other countries, and I don't like using the term global south, but other countries in emerging frontier markets. And I think, you know, we as Africans, we need to, you know, we have after the African Free Trade Zone that's set up, we don't even trade within ourselves, right? I mean, I know there's been some efforts to have a cross-continental currency. You know, there's certain things we can do to get our house in order, but some of these countries just don't have the. I mean, we need to discuss this more, but governance and accountability is paramount. I mean, there's countries that are, you know, why is, you know, there's certain countries is continually going to these institutions to get support, budget support. Then one has to ask yourself, why is that, right? Yes, you can use COVID as an excuse, but COVID impacted everybody. You know, there's not one country on this earth that was not impacted by COVID. So, you know, what are we doing now so that the next pandemic or next economic shock, you have the systems in place, or you're trying to get more government tax revenue so that you have a good a buffer, right? That's why, you know, everybody's talking about growing economies. That's good, but let's be honest, there are entities that are not paying their fair share of tax, right? And you know, when you're trying to tax the average person, look at what happened to Kenya. There's that issue, right? So there's a lot of things that are going on that I think are good. There's certain things that we need to do a much better job of. In terms of the question about how can the diaspora be used as how can the African diaspora are you referring to the question that's on the board, Clifford?
Yes. Yeah, the number 2, the one that we sent to you.
Yeah. Oh, number 2. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question about remittances, everybody talks about remittances, and they're very, very important. However, most remittances are used for consumption. I mean, I'm not an economist. Michelle can go into detail about the consumption for most of these countries, but I would guess, if I had to guesstimate, I would say 95% of remittances, funds that people from overseas are sending to somebody, are used to pay for a school fee, hospital bills, that sort of thing, right? They're not being used to invest or to help a country plug its budget, right? But you know, when I was at the bank, the World Bank, there, you know, I had a conversation with a couple people, different entities about, you know, if you know, what's a possibility of, you know, doing some kind of structured finance vehicle for future cash flows, right? But I didn't want to really go into, that wasn't my mandate, right? But that conversation or that talk has come up before. And one of the things I said is, okay, if most of these remittances are being used, and we know you can do like you know, future cash flow, maybe, you know, do a structured finance vehicle based on the future cash flow, maybe there's a possibility. And then you have diaspora bonds. There's a guy named Dilip Ratha. He's sort of Dilip Ratha is the expert for diaspora bonds at the bank. He's written about this. He's spoken about this. I've talked to him about this. I think there's certain countries that are really great recipients for using, you know, diaspora bonds to help with economic development. Countries that have good governance, good accountability, and have a strong cultural tie. I'm Ghanaian American. I'm not sure if Ghana could do that. Ghana had this year of return. I think Ghana had a Ghana missed opportunity to really do some interesting things. I think if Ghana would have used their diaspora to support vaccine manufacturing or to help with making things, there was a lot of talk around music and arts and crafts. Those are really interesting, but we need to start manufacturing on the continent. What better way to help with the COVID effort by manufacturing vaccines? Now, everybody now knows that India is the #1 vaccine manufacturer. Well, how did that happen? It's the diaspora. The Indian professionals that were in Europe got their degrees and over time went back to India, right? And that's over time, because this just didn't happen over 5 years. This is a concerted effort by the Indian government to lay a plan and strategy to help support that. So I don't know if I answered the question, Clifford. I kind of gave different case studies and answers, so I'll stop there.
No problem. We have a question from our audience. Obina?
Thank you very much. I would lower my hand now. My name is Obina. I am a lawyer. I am from Nigeria, currently living in the United States. And it's very beautiful to listen to the panel and everything that they have been saying so far. Mine is just to point out some 4 things, but I'll be very brief. First of all, I'm wondering, what's your view about the politics and governance in most of these countries in Africa that you talked about? For now, over my, just counting, there are about 3 countries in Africa right now that's under military rule. We had coups and counter coups that happened just a couple of months ago. And it also seems that the countries where that's ostensibly in democracy have some, stifling democratic space right now. A lot of countries have touted about electoral reforms, but we find out that elections doesn't seem to look like there has been any reforms at all, because we've had issues of malpractices during elections, and it doesn't look like the bank, or the IMF or these institutions have anything, in that particular regard, noticing that somehow governance affects, or politics affects the economy. And for most people outside who see that people lose elections and they go to court, they cannot get justice, it could also touch down on who want to come and invest in the country. And that also draws me into justice reforms. For instance, speedy justice delivery, alternative dispute resolutions, all those things that are cognate to development and to investment. Do we do anything in that regard, any form of interventions in that regard? And lastly, it's about security. I know that Nigeria presently, and of course other countries, you rightly mentioned in your presentation, Michelle, about what's happening in the Sahel. It's becoming so unfortunate now that we thought that the Sahel was actually, things were getting better within that particular beltway. But what we see now is that criminality seems to have resurfaced and there's a resurgence of it. Are you giving any support to governments across that area to see what they can do about security in that particular, within that particular region? And just a comment to make about diaspora. I believe that Nneka and Neil has made a very wonderful point about diaspora. One of the things that's actually got me, it's very interesting if you come into the United States, is the fact that there is a very large diaspora presence of Nigerians, for instance, particularly in the medical field. I don't know how many hospitals that you would go to that you wouldn't see probably Nigerian nurses in that particular place. But the issue is that there is no coordination. If you move to somewhere like in Dallas in Texas, it seems that almost one of every, this is just a rough estimate of like 10 nurses will be Nigerians, but there is no coordination within that particular regard. Nneka, do you think that it is best for there to be sectoral coordination and having the general thing about diaspora remittances, maybe coordinating it within particular professions? Do you think that will work out best? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, let me try to answer that. So I think that you're right. Like diaspora are often drawn to certain areas. Healthcare is a good one. And yeah, so I think a sector by sector strategy could make sense, especially in the context of, you mentioned Nigeria, so I'll just go there. One of the biggest issues facing the Nigerian healthcare system is also lack of skilled professionals, right? And that's the backbone of a healthcare system. So there could be, initiatives around like, I don't know, skills transfer. So you could do all sorts of things. So I think that, diaspora do typically want to see where their money is going to. I think it's actually human. It's just not a diaspora specific thing. So investments where you can actually see the output of your investment, especially when you're in a low trust environment, like I spoke about, like people emigrating for reasons, right? So not wanting like your investment to just go down a fungible black hole where you can't really like track like outputs and outcomes. So yeah, I think having specific projects, it seems like healthcare would resonate, other things like education. So there have been mixed successes with diaspora bonds, as you know, and Nigeria is also, planning to raise one in the near future, targeting a $1 billion issuance focused on, professionals in the US. But yeah, I do think a sector by sector strategy could make sense. Healthcare is a good one just because of the mix of diaspora professionals in that field, but then also there's a great need in healthcare as well. So yeah, it would make sense. But yeah, I think if I was the government, I would, start by just listening and like trying to understand the needs of diaspora and investment preferences, and then trying to like tailor something that, reflects those needs and realities on the ground.
If I can briefly take Obina's question on policy, governance, and then the issues in the Sahel. So talking about the issue of governance, this has been one of the key points that we have been raising in the last few years with many countries. Just to give you a concrete example, one of the analytical notes that we produced for this report in October talks about the divergence in economic performance between countries that are resource exporters and countries that have more diversified economies. Now, we try to trace where this divergence that has really emerged in the last 10 years comes from and why that is the case. And it turns out that, of course, there was a shock about 10 years ago, a very big shock on international commodity markets. You might remember around 2014, 2015, the oil price collapsed and the price of many commodities also came down significantly. And so that created an external shock on countries that rely on the exports of these particular goods for their economy. But then why, after the price of commodities and the price of oil recovered, these countries are still not doing well? And the answer that we find is that they differ compared to the other countries along crucial metrics in governance, especially. So transparency, rule of law, trust in governments, diversification of the economy, all of these factors, low social capital, these are all factors that you can see expanded on in the note that we really highlight. Now, of course, this is an example of surveillance. That's what we do. So we advise countries on what we think would be best in terms of policy, and we really learn from the data. So in this case, it's an exercise in learning from past experience and then distilling advice based on that. When we engage with countries that have economic programs with the IMF, so financing arrangements, we also agree with them on specific benchmarks that they need to achieve in these areas. So they might have structural benchmarks that require the publication of documentation on public debt. For instance, that would increase transparency and fight of corruption and similar efforts. So I just want to really emphasize that this is one of the key ways in which we engage with countries in the region, and we really believe that it can make a difference because you can see it in the economic performance of different countries. Now, moving on to the issue of security in the Sahel. Of course, this has been a dramatic few years for the region. It started off just arbitrarily Mali in 2012 with the first attacks, and then the situation in these countries has been unstable ever since, with multiple coups d'etat since 2020. We remain engaged with countries in the Sahel. Many of those countries have actually active programs. Niger as a program, and it also has a resilience and sustainability facility. Burkina Faso has a program, and Mali, we are in active discussions for a program. I know the case of Mali more specifically because I am on the Mali team. So we absolutely engage with these countries, and we try to support them in the challenges that they are facing. Of course, as I said before, we don't provide support for specific projects, but we provide budget support, and these countries have been facing a lot of shocks, so that's why we remain engaged. Let me stop there.
Yeah, and then I'll add a little bit on the Sahel. I don't know. Michelle mentioned there's been since 2012. There's been some coups. I mean, I think since 2012 we had what 4 or 5 coups. It's a big concern. I mean, when there's a coup, not only do you have a flight of capital, the multilaterals stop they essentially stop financing or programs. If you have any foreign direct investments, companies like Coke, Pepsi, others, they unfortunately leave, right? And that's what you're seeing. And but you've had all these coups, and what I have to ask yourself is, why have these coups happened? Why are in some countries citizens are backing the coups, right? And they're backing because they haven't seen the economic benefit of sending a certain European country a certain mineral for its electricity power production, right? And I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves as Africans is, what can we put in place in terms of governance and accountability? A lot of our issues or challenges come to governance and accountability. If we can figure that out and also have a broad spectrum of leaders and women leaders in public office from the mayoral standpoint, and then governorship in Nigeria, you have state governors. I think some of these individuals who have experience can contest to be the prime minister or president, right? So, the continent in the next 20, 25 years, we're going to have 2.5 billion. We have a lot of challenges now, and those challenges will be exponential. So we need to figure out ways that we can have a broad coalition of new future leaders, more women, and then also make sure that we have conversations with our ex-colonial masters to say, hey, look, you just can't keep taking out critical rare earth minerals without adding value and then not giving us our fair share, right? So I'll leave that at that. I think we have another question. Clifford, I'll let you handle that.
All right. Thank you. Okay. We will move to Hassan. Hassan, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hello, hi. Thanks for having me. Good morning. I'm here in Los Angeles on the West Coast. Great speak to all the panels. I had a quick question for Nneka. During your presentation, you mentioned about challenges in terms of getting local currencies for projects. I think you mentioned something around those lines, or unlocking local currency for projects. So I wanted to say, why is that so? And another question is, does it benefit diasporas or people overseas, diasporas, to invest with US dollars, and then the returns, is it going to be even make sense in their ROIs, in their investments, because of the exchange rate discrepancies?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So when it comes to the supply of local currency financing, I guess the first port of call is typically the banks. So the banks are usually the biggest providers of credit, so debt. And so when you look at the situation on the ground, there's a lot of market distortions, right? So in Nigeria, for example, government securities are currently returning north of 20%. So that means that banks are requiring 30% or so thereabout as their interest rates for the local currency that they have available. So, you know, that is very crippling to a small business to be able to afford financing that is costing 30%. So what is happening is that a lot of the local currency that is available is just chasing government securities because, you know, why work when you can just get like 20-25% for just giving your money to the government, right? So yeah, and to Michele's point, like they have to, the government, central banks have to make like tough decisions, right? Because inflation is also high, which is why they're like just tightening the credits. But then it has the side effect of restricting credit availability to SMEs and the real sector. So that is one reason why foreign currency, local currency is not really available. And then also because of the devaluation, right? So it just becomes a downward spiral because the Naira has devalued, as has, you know, the Zambian kwanza and all sorts of other African currencies. So people expect it to perform poorly because it's performed poorly. So because they expect it to perform poorly, they rather like hedge by buying USD. But when they're buying USD, when they don't really need the USD, it's driving up demand for USD relative to the local currency. So the situation just gets worse. But of course, no one is willing to be the person that says like, I'm going to go all in on the Naira because they've seen the trends, right? And they're, oh, these are their savings. And, you know, they also require a return to your second question. So these are some of the reasons. So we need something to kind of like just stop that vicious circle, which is why I think the DFIs have a part to play because, you know, they have like a substantial amount of capital. They can afford to take that risk. Something like DFC, you know, they are funded by budget appropriation, so they don't even really have a return threshold. So I think that they should be able to at least have like pools of their capital available to provide local currency. So we're seeing some like foundations step up, the likes of MasterCard Foundation. We're working with them in Ghana, for example, and they're, you know, effectively just buying down the interest rate because, you know, that's what the SMEs need. They need access to credits, which they don't have. So yeah, so we need more of that. We need more risk taking. If you're someone in diaspora asking me if you should invest in Naira, I mean, it depends on your risk tolerance, right? So, and your time horizon. Like I'm personally like allocating some of my portfolio to like Naira denominated investments, maybe because I'm a patriot, but then also, I mean, I think it's what needs to be done. And then also in the long term, like if the situation continues as it is, then it's only going to become worse. So there needs to be a shift. But, you know, I definitely wouldn't advise, anyway, I'm not even like supposed to be giving investment advice on this call. So, I mean, I can't tell you what the returns would be if you choose to invest in like Naira denominated assets, but it depends on your risk tolerance, your overall like portfolio allocation, etc. But yeah, so I think that for the situation to change, we do need a shift because if it continues, it's just going to, the balance, the structural imbalance is just going to worsen without a shift. Yeah, so yeah, those are some of the reasons why the local currency is scarce and, you know, just my reflections on the overall state of play.
Thank you. And one last question. And you said your outfit is based in Lagos, right?
Yeah, so Cross Boundary, we have 11 offices across Africa. I'm personally based in Lagos, but I'm a partner overseeing an Africa business. So we're also in Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Mauritius, Tunisia, DRC, Senegal. We also have a presence on the ground in Mali, Benin, Togo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, as well, and have done projects everywhere, Niger, South Sudan, Mauritania. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And your contact is in the chat, or how do we get your contact information?
I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn, but maybe the BPIA might send like details around. But yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn, so happy to connect further.
Okay.
I'm Chime on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. And we have one last question, and then we will move to closing. So we have one last question in the chat. How can the African diaspora contribute more effectively to economic development in Africa? And what practical strategies can governments and businesses implement to harness this potential? One thing that I quickly thought of, and I'm not interjecting in the conversation, but if it's supporting some of the initiatives that each of you have mentioned and supporting that. But I don't know who best would want to tackle that question, but posing that to the three of our panelists today.
Yeah, I'll chime in. How can the question is, how can the diaspora be used to support a country's economic development? And you know, there's several ways. I think if you're asking a diaspora to invest their hard-earned money into a project they can't see, hear, touch, I think that's probably non-starter unless you have like a strong cultural tie. I think Ethiopia has sort of given us a case saying that, but they use their cultural identity. I think it's better to build a rapport with somebody. It's kind of like dating. You're not going to ask somebody who you're just dating to just pay for your iPhone bill, right? You have to build that rapport with time. And then as they see the opportunity, they're going to invest their savings or here in the US, we have our pension or 401k. You're going to say, wow, we think this startup, this part of this incubator, we think that they have an interesting, compelling story that's solving a market need, and I've been mentoring them. Yeah, I wouldn't mind putting putting risk capital towards that, right? So that's just one area, and for governments who are, if you're trying to use your diaspora to support your budget or your support, infrastructure or what have you, I think one of the things that you have to also look at is how can you build that confidence by making sure that you have strong systems in place in terms of governance accountability, right? So that's what I'll say to that.
All right. Thank you so much, Nii, Nneka, and Michele. We will now move to our committee, the Business and Economic Development Committee's member at large for our wrap-up and closing. That would be Abby Ogunwale.
Thank you so much. So I'm trying to, we really appreciate the last 90 minutes and the conversations we've had. So we'd like to say a big thank you to our speakers for sharing your insights and also where opportunities lie on the landscape in Africa. A big thank you to our teams at BPIA, the business and economic team, as well as the communications team behind the scenes. Thank you so much. So we want to provide 2 links, one for BPIA to join, for you to join the community. And we do lots of these kind of events, some monthly, some at times we do few a month. And in particularly, if you're interested in joining the committee that put together this particular event, which is the business and economic team, please click these links, stay connected, and let us know when you have opportunities for us to improve on or things that we can discuss together as a community. With that said, I don't want to take much of your time, but please let us stay connected with ourselves. And if you have any kind of questions to learn more about BPIA or this committee, feel free to reach out to us by email. And also we'll be able to keep you connected and plugged in on our future opportunities. With that said, I'll be wrapping up now and we'll be closing, and we hope to see you in our future events. So stay safe and have a wonderful day. Thank you.